Hi, we're going to be doing the second part of Chapter 18 today on microevolution. And we finished Chapter 18, Part 1 in talking about genetic drift. Now, I want to make sure you don't get that confused with our next topic here, which is gene flow. Now, both drift and flow sound like something kind of just wandering its way down the river or something, but the ideas are very, very different. In genetic drift, the whole idea was about the fact that there are random things that can affect how a population evolves. There are just certain things like natural disasters that may alter the allele frequencies within a population. Well, gene flow is a very specific thing that happens. Gene flow is when you have members of a population that either leave the population or new members that move in. And just the idea that if you have a group of members of a species here, as some of them wander out, their genes literally are flowing out of the original group. The reason that's important at all is because that's going to end up kind of affecting the gene pool of the group, whether some individuals are immigrating or emigrating. But what it ends up doing, let's say we have two populations. If members are going back and forth between them, what that's going to do is keep those two populations similar enough that they can still interbreed. If those two populations are separated with no gene flow between them, then what you're going to see is over time, most likely the two populations changing due to both natural selection and genetic drift in such a way that they may become different enough from each other they can't interbreed. With the gene flow, that kind of keeps a connection between them and keeps them the same species. Now, when we're talking about selection, we have to refer to different types of selection. Some of these are more common and easier to picture than others. We're going to start with what we usually think of the most often, which is directional selection. Directional selection might be something we think of like a species becoming progressively faster over time, or becoming larger, or certain coloration becoming more common. It would help them blend in, like with camouflage. But what it is when the overall population is seeing a shift in certain alleles either becoming more common or less common due to the environment. And if we graph this, you see on the graph here, early on in this population, for whatever trait we're looking at, there's like a bell curve where the average is whatever the most common phenotype is for this particular trait. And over time, that average starts to shift in some direction. That's what we call a directional selection. So maybe this is a fish species, and we're mapping out the speed at which they swim. Most of the fish are average swimmers, but over time, as more and more slow swimmers get eaten by predators, that whole population is going to evolve, become faster and faster swimmers. That would be a directional selection. Now, the textbook example of this is something called the peppered moth of England. And the story is something you can definitely look into. It's kind of a fascinating story with these moths. And we have two of them in the picture here. They're called peppered because they're kind of black and white. And they blend in on some lichens on the tree bark in England. And actually there are two in this picture here. You can probably see the one very clearly. The second one here I've outlined for you so you can see it a little bit better. But over time, the peppered moth became the more familiar coloration, the more common coloration, even though those two are the same species, until the environment changed. And when the environment changed and the lichens ended up dying off, what we saw was a progressive shift toward the darker color being more and more favored. So the coloration was shifting in a direction toward the darker colored moth. And again, if you can't see the darker one, I've outlined for you again there. And then ironically enough, in the true story of the peppered moth, after a while the lichens came back and we saw directional selection back to the peppered form again. Well, another thing we talk about in terms of types of selection is what we call stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection is not when we're moving in a direction, but when we're kind of seeing average becoming more and more common. Again, if we want to graph this, the dotted line would show an original distribution for a certain trait, and then over time, being average is becoming more common, the extremes are becoming less and less common. And what it ends up causing is the population to, for this particular trait, to become more and more and more similar. Now, a reason for this, and we see this quite often in many species where there is mate selection, being average size ends up often being an advantage because very, very large or very small individuals may have a tough time finding a mate. And think about it for yourself. Would you really want to date someone who's 2 feet taller than you or 2 feet shorter than you? You probably can see why someone around more typical size is going to be probably something that you'd be more happy with. Not that you couldn't date someone taller or shorter, but general preference tends to be someone who kind of blends into the crowd and doesn't stand out and isn't quite so unusual. We also might see this with coloration, where variations might make you easier to see be seen by predators, and kind of blending into the average in the group may help out. Maybe something like zebras, where if you had really dark or light colors, you wouldn't mix in with the whole herd quite as well. We also have what's called a disruptive selection. That's where it's actually favorable to be more extreme and to not be average. Now, this is a much less common type of thing. We do see it sometimes in species where maybe the background, the environment has two different colors. Maybe it's a field of flowers where there's the color of the flower petals, then plus the color of the leaves. And it's to your advantage to blend into one or the other, but not to be kind of in between. So let's say it's a field of red flowers. Being red would be good, being green would be good, but being kind of halfway between red and green would not be good. So what we end up seeing is two different forms of a particular trait kind of coexisting at the same time. What we have here, this is an African swallowtail butterfly, a very well-known butterfly. All three of these colorations are the same species, and even though in the past the yellow one seems to be the most common, we're starting to see a rise in the others because this white formation actually looks like another species that tastes really bad to birds. And the orange coloration also looks like a different species that tastes bad to birds. The yellow one doesn't look like any other species. And so what we're seeing over time, again, the dotted line is the original kind of shift in the particular coloration for this species. And over time, that middle color, the yellow, kind of the intermediate color, is becoming less common. And then the extremes, the white and the orange, are becoming more common. Now, if you have those two different phenotypes, something like a disruptive selection, it's kind of weird to think about what might help to maintain this. And when we do maintain them, we have terms for them. We sometimes call it a balanced polymorphism. Balanced meaning these things are at equilibrium, they're not becoming more common or less common. And polymorphism meaning that there are many forms showing up instead of just one form of this particular trait for the species. And a reason would be like with the swallowtails, if being both white and orange, well, actually white or orange is an advantage, then they both will become more common and will be fairly stable. Another case where this might happen is if being a heterozygous individual is an advantage. There are some traits where it's good to be heterozygous, and if that's the case, you'll keep seeing homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive ones showing up, even though there's not necessarily an advantage there. They're going to show up in fairly stable amounts. A case of this in humans is the sickle cell disease. It's an advantage in tropical areas to be heterozygous. If you're homozygous for the sickle cell trait, you're probably going to die from sickle cell disease. If you're homozygous for not having it, you're probably going to die from malaria. But being heterozygous makes you immune to malaria, and yet you don't have sickle cell. And so what we see is these balanced phenotypes of those that are homozygous dominant, those that are heterozygous, those that are homozygous recessive, each showing up in fairly stable amounts, even though it seems like being in the middle would be good. The heterozygous individuals keep producing more and more of each type of homozygous form. Now, the one case where it's sometimes more clear to see these balanced polymorphisms is specifically when the many forms are exactly two forms, and those two forms happen to be the two genders. If that's the case, we call it a sexual dimorphism. We use the prefix di because there are only two genders with this. And this is when sexual selection is the important thing in terms of determining what traits are going to be successful. And you end up with different appearances based on gender. Now, there are some forms of this, some things we see in humans, but a much more extreme version is found in many species of birds. We have here a very well-known cardinal species. The red cardinal over here is very brightly colored red. There's an advantage to that. Females are more attracted to the red males, and if a male has like a tan coloration or any coloration that's not as bright red, he's probably not going to be able to reproduce, probably won't pass his traits on, his genes on to the next generation. And you won't see as many red cardinals in the next generation if he would have reproduced. However, since the red ones are the ones reproducing, the offspring tend to be primarily red if they're males. The female here, kind of tan in coloration, she doesn't need a color to attract the males. The males aren't overly picky, they'll mate with any colored female. The females, though, need to blend in so that Predators won't see them when they're sitting on the nest. If she's bright red, odds are she and her offspring probably will not survive because a predator will get them. So it's an advantage to be tan. And so we see these two colorations that have now become linked to gender. So again, we call it a sexual dimorphism. That's the end of chapter 18. Again, if you have any questions, please bring them to class, and I hope you have a great day.